This is the Ceton Infinity V 6 ETH cable TV tuner. This is a cable card tuner device. It requires the use of a thing called a cable card. Now this particular Infinity V 6 ETH has failed, and we are going to troubleshoot it and find the problem and get it running again. But first, a little history. Cable cards were mandated by the FCC a number of years ago in order to prevent cable companies from having a monopoly on cable box hardware. So you could purchase a cable box or cable box / DVR combination from a third party. However, in order to work with the encrypted signals, they required a device called a cable card, and that's this device right here. This is a Motorola M card, and there's a slot in the front where this card slides in. And then you have the cable TV signal coming into this connector, and you have an Ethernet connector here connecting your cable box to your computer, and we have a power input here. This device has worked really well for me. I really like these things. This thing has saved me a lot of money over the years, but it has recently gone bad. It has a failure that I call the red light of death, and we will demonstrate that. I'm going to go ahead and connect an Ethernet line to it. We don't need an RF signal to demonstrate the problem. I'll go ahead and connect the power supply. Now, what we see when we start up, we get a red light at first, and now it starts flashing blue, and then we should get a solid blue. Okay, now we have a solid blue. This is what is supposed to happen. But with this particular one, after a little while, the blue light's going to go out and the red light's going to come back on again. After a few minutes, this is what happens. The light went out. We got a red. Okay, there's the failure. The blue light went out, and now the light turned red. Power went out. The Ethernet light went out briefly, and now it's starting over again. It's trying to reboot itself. And we'll now get into a cycle where it does this over and over again. We'll get a blue light for a little bit, and it will go out, turn red, and cycle off and on again. There's the red. The cable card box is now shut off. It's now rebooting itself again. Now it's stuck in this cycle over and over again, and you've basically lost your cable TV at this point. So now what exactly is causing this? So that's the failure. I'm going to go ahead and unplug the power and the Ethernet cable. You may have noticed the top is loose, and that's because it is. I actually took the top off as part of the troubleshooting. So if you wonder what the inside of this thing looks like, there it is. There's where our cable card plugs in. And by the way, getting the top off is really hard. They built this thing in a way that it's very clear they didn't want people getting into it. When I first looked it over, I couldn't figure out how on earth to open this thing. And then I noticed just a little bit of a groove on this side. The way that it opens is you've got to get a screwdriver right in here, right there. And then you've got to really work it in, because this thing is in very, very tight. And then kind of pry this thing out. It's not held with any screws or anything. It's got these little tabs like there and there. It's got a big one on this side here. And it fits in these grooves. You probably can't see it. It's probably everything's so matte black. I guess you can kind of see this one here. So this is a big thick plate of aluminum, and this stuff is really, really hard plastic. So if you do want to open it up for any reason, you go right there, and you really have to work it in, get between the plate and this hard rubber, and then sort of pry it out. Okay, now I did remove the top. Turns out I didn't have to, because I did figure out what the problem was, and it's not even in the box at all. The problem, it turns out, is this. This is the power supply that comes with the device. So it acts kind of like it's trying to start. Like maybe the voltage isn't just quite high enough. And so my suspicion fell on the power supply. One of the common failures of these devices, particularly these little cheap power supplies, is electrolytic capacitors can go bad. Our power supply is 12 volts DC and 1.5 amps. Now, the tip is very important. You got to get these tips right. Now, this tip is 5.5 millimeters outer diameter and 2.1 millimeters inner diameter, and it's tip positive. Now, one thing we can do is plug it in and measure the voltage at the tip. Okay, now we have a digital multimeter, black to the ground, the outer barrel, and it says 14.8 volts, a little bit high for a 12-volt power supply. So you would think it's normal. However, a normal reading can be deceiving because the power supply is unloaded. Normally when the power supply has something at the other end of it, like our Ceton device, it's going to draw current. The digital multimeter, on the other hand, has a very high input impedance and draws a very tiny amount of current. A power supply with a bad output capacitor might appear to be normal with no load. That's because the bad capacitors really show up when they're loaded. That is, when they have to put out more current. That's when the voltage will drop. So the fact that we have a normal voltage output from this thing doesn't mean that this power supply is good. Another way we can test our power supply is comparing it to a known good power supply. And I just happen to have one. I've got a whole box of old power supplies that I've saved from other things, pieces of equipment that have been thrown away. Every time I come across a power supply, I save it. I got a big box full. So here we have another power supply that is basically the same, 12 volts, slightly lower amperage, but should be adequate. Same tip, 5.5 by 2.1 millimeters. So I shall plug this power supply in and connect it to our Ceton device and see if that fixes it. And if it does, that pretty well incriminates the old power supply. We have plugged our replacement power supply into the AC wall socket, and we will now connect our Ceton device to our replacement power supply. And we get this red light on startup. And we get a flashing blue light. You see our Ethernet connection is active. And now we get a solid blue light. Okay, and that's what we want to see. It will now stay blue. I've already tested this power supply and it works. We can just use this power supply to repair our Ceton device. So if you're having this problem, what you need to acquire is a replacement power supply. 12 volts, at least 1.5 amps, outer barrel 5.5 millimeters, inner barrel 2.1 millimeters, and tip positive. And there are lots of those for sale on Amazon and eBay and AliExpress and so forth for just a few dollars. And that really should be the end of our video. However, I'm curious. I want to know exactly what's going on the inside of this power supply and can we fix it? So if you're curious like I am, stick around and we will take this apart and see if we can troubleshoot it and fix it right down to the component level. And on the bottom, we have two screws that have to come out. We'll go ahead and get those out. Now the two screws are out and you would hope that the thing would just pull apart, but it doesn't. This thing is really glued. It's actually glued down really tightly. In order to get the top off of it, I had to take a knife and work it into that seam between the top and the bottom. The screwdriver's too thick, so I needed something just as thin as a knife's edge to get into this seam right here. You know, I've already done it, but I worked it in like so, and then you sort of work your way around, sort of popping it off. You sort of go around it like this, sort of, pop, sort of leveraging it loose, and finally you can get this thing to come off. It came off easily because I've already done it. A very small, cheap, low-end switching type power supply. And we have two capacitors, one on the input side and one on the output side. We'll try the capacitor on the input side. Of course, it's in circuit, but it's reading no ESR at all. Let's try the capacitor on the output side. 11 ohms. That's suspicious. Okay, so that's going to require a further looking at. So we're going to desolder this capacitor and look at it out of circuit. Okay, I have removed that output capacitor, and now I have it separate, and we can measure it by itself. Wow, 19 ohms, and it says leaky. So this capacitor is completely bad. Now, this bad capacitor is 680 microfarads and 16 volts. Here's about the closest I've got to that original 680 microfarad capacitor. This capacitor is labeled 1000 microfarads, 16 volts. It measures 0 ESR, of course, which is good, but it's measuring 872 microfarads. I've got a whole bag of these, and they're all measuring a little bit low. They're all measuring in that 800 range. I don't know, maybe a quality control issue or a mislabeling, I don't know. But 870, that's pretty close to 680. I think we can live with that. Okay, so this is what we're going to put in. It's a little bit shorter and a little bit wider than the original, but it looks like it'll fit. We have our new electrolytic capacitor in place. No, I'm not going to re-glue it. I'm just going to put these screws back in. And now we can test it with our Ceton 6 ETH and see if the light stays blue. Okay, so here is our original power supply after being repaired and put back together. We will plug this in and see if it fixes our problem. Okay, the original power supply is plugged into the wall socket, and we now connect our Ceton to the original power supply after it has been repaired. Brief red flash, flashing blue light, and solid blue. And it will stay solid blue. And I've already tested it, and it does work. Okay, so that is the fix. So the problem all along was the power supply. Our Ceton device was perfectly fine. It was our cheap power supply. And so for just a couple of bucks, you can fix it by buying another power supply. And again, that's 12 volts, at least 1.5 amps, 5.5 millimeter by 2.1 millimeter tip positive. But if you're really brave and you want to challenge yourself and you're not afraid of soldering things, well, you might go ahead and try to fix the original. Well, I hope this video has helped somebody out there. Thanks for watching.